Do we really need to distance ourselves from everything and everyone to be truly free? This question unsettles us. After all, shouldn't freedom mean connections, limitless choices, and the right to share our lives with others? For Nietzsche, however, genuine freedom is something much deeper, an act of courage that often leads us to isolation. This is where the paradox lies. How can something so often avoided, like solitude, bring us closer to our essence? Yet, it's in silence, when distractions fade away, that we begin to notice what truly matters. At some point, all of us face situations where solitude arises either as a choice or a consequence. It could be the end of a relationship, the decision to change careers, or distancing ourselves from people who no longer share our values. These moments, though difficult, confront us with questions we often avoid when surrounded by the noise of external expectations. Nietzsche believed that true freedom doesn't lie in societal conventions or the constant pursuit of approval. It emerges when we create our own values and take responsibility for them, a process that requires embracing isolation as an essential part of self-discovery. For him, isolation isn't a loss, but a necessary condition for finding authenticity. Let's explore how this perspective on freedom challenges us to view isolation differently, and why, even in a world that prizes superficial connection, solitude might be the key to becoming more human. Freedom, a word that carries the promise of endless choices and an open horizon, but which, according to Nietzsche, is much more complex and demanding. For him, being truly free is not just about making decisions, but about living according to your own rules, creating your values and rejecting imposed conventions. This concept, initially inspiring, introduces a paradox. To achieve this freedom, one must step away from the herd, the conformist masses that follow norms without questioning them, and this separation almost inevitably leads to solitude. Imagine someone deciding to change careers, leaving behind a stable, socially accepted profession, to pursue something that only makes sense to them. Suddenly they face disapproving looks, subtle criticisms, and even the loss of support from those who once seemed to be on their side. Solitude sets in as an unwelcome companion. Yet Nietzsche believed this phase is essential to achieving freedom. Freedom is the will to be responsible for oneself, he said. This means bearing the cost of the isolation that comes with choosing a unique path. This paradox plays out in everyday situations. Think of how often the desire to please others drives us to make choices that don't align with who we truly are. It's easy to go with the flow, but that comfort comes at a price, the abandonment of our authenticity. For Nietzsche, stepping away from the herd is painful, but it's also a way to separate what is genuinely ours from what has been imposed upon us. Solitude, in this context, is not just a consequence. It is a necessity. Every step away from external expectations is a step toward inner freedom. Being alone does not mean being lost, but rather being on the path to discovering something no one can take away from us. The ability to be authentic, solitude, often feared, can be seen as a process of distillation, where the essential remains and the superficial dissolves, just as clear water emerges when impurities are removed. Isolation strips away the layers of masks and expectations we accumulate over a lifetime to please others. Nietzsche saw this process as a prerequisite for self-discovery. Only in the absence of external voices can we truly hear who we are. Without filters or interference, imagine someone who, after years of social commitments and external pressures, decides to step back and reflect. At first, the emptiness can be overwhelming. It's uncomfortable to realize how many choices, ranging from small preferences to major life decisions, were made to satisfy others. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. That moment when, in solitude, you questioned how many of your actions were driven by genuine desires and how many were simply attempts to fit in or gain approval. Nietzsche believed that in isolation, we face the most honest mirror, ourselves, without the echoes of the herd to distract us. We are forced to confront our fears, contradictions, and true desires. This confrontation, though challenging, is essential for anyone seeking freedom. It's like cleaning a foggy window. The process takes effort, but the result is a clear and unobstructed view. If you cannot bear to be with yourself when alone, how can you expect to live authentically? This question challenges us to see solitude not as something to be avoided, but as a tool for transformation. It is uncomfortable, yes, but also profoundly liberating. By allowing what is false to dissolve, isolation reveals what has real value. Friedrich Nietzsche is a prime example of how solitude can be transformed into a state of profound creativity. During years of voluntary seclusion, far from the hectic pace of society, he produced some of the most influential works in philosophy. Living in remote villages and isolated mountain retreats, Nietzsche found in silence the inspiration needed to explore ideas that defied the conventions of his time. His ability to create did not stem from comfort, but from the discomfort of facing isolation head-on. Nietzsche believed that silence is not empty. It is a space full of possibilities. Just as a sculptor needs time and focus to carve a form out of a block of marble, isolation allows the human mind to refine and shape its deepest ideas. He himself remarked, "He who would learn to fly must first learn to walk, run, and climb. He must first overcome himself." In the modern world, creativity often emerges during moments of retreat. Think of a writer stepping away from daily distractions to work on a novel, or a scientist isolating themselves to focus on solving a complex problem. These periods of withdrawal provide the mental space necessary to work without external interference. Nietzsche clearly understood this potential. Away from the noise of the world, we discover not only what we think, but also what we are capable of. Nietzsche's creative solitude teaches us that silence is an invitation to exploration. It is not a state of absence, but a condition where answers and ideas can emerge with full force. By embracing solitude as part of the creative process, we give ourselves the chance to transform isolation into achievement. We live in an era that glorifies connection but avoids solitude at all costs. The noise of notifications, the overexposure on social media, and the reliance on digital interactions have made solitude almost unthinkable. For Nietzsche, this rejection of solitude not only limits our freedom, but distances us from ourselves. He viewed dependence on the collective as a prison that prevents us from developing true autonomy. The contemporary fear of solitude is reflected in our obsession with always being busy. Many fill their days with endless activities, not out of necessity, but to avoid the discomfort of being alone with their own thoughts. It is in this emptiness, disguised by distractions, that one of the greatest obstacles to freedom resides. Hyperconnection turns silence into a taboo, when in fact, it is in silence that we find the space to reflect, create, and reconnect with who we are. Nietzsche challenges us with a question that resonates even more in modern times. Are we truly connected, or just distracted from the fear of being alone? This reflection invites us to question whether our interactions, digital or face-to-face, truly enrich our lives, or merely serve to avoid confronting solitude. The contrast between Nietzsche's perspective and modern mentality is striking. While the philosopher saw isolation as a gateway to authenticity, our era does everything to avoid that confrontation. Yet silence and introspection, so undervalued today, might be the key to freeing ourselves from external pressures and rediscovering what truly matters. For Nietzsche, isolation does not distance us from humanity. On the contrary, it is in silence that we rediscover our most authentic essence. Society often encourages us to believe that the meaning of life lies in constantly being surrounded by people, activities, and noise. However, Nietzsche saw solitude as a space where the individual can finally emerge. Free from imposed expectations, solitude is like diving to the depths of the ocean. At first, the silence and darkness seem threatening, but it is in the depths that we find hidden treasures, authentic ideas, forgotten passions, and truths untouched by external pressures. For Nietzsche, it is in this state of isolation that we transcend the superficial layers imposed by society and access a deeper connection with who we truly are. A clear example of this concept can be seen in the experience of Henry David Thoreau, who isolated himself in a cabin in the woods to write Walden. He sought simplicity and introspection, distancing himself from the chaos of society to reconnect with nature and with himself. Like Nietzsche, Thoreau saw isolation not as an act of renunciation, but as an opportunity to find freedom and authenticity. "You must become who you are," Nietzsche once said, emphasizing that freedom requires an honest confrontation with one's own essence. In solitude, there are no distractions or artifices to mask our internal realities. It is in this space, where we are alone with our choices and truths, that freedom ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes a tangible experience. The rediscovery of our humanity, therefore, is not about avoiding solitude, but embracing it. Solitude does not separate us from others. Instead, it reconnects us to a truer version of ourselves, where external pressures no longer shape us, and we begin to live according to our own values. Nietzsche had a term for the force that drives us toward conformity: the herd. This metaphor describes the collective that follows accepted norms without questioning them, rejecting and even ostracizing those who dare to be different. The herd offers safety, but that safety comes at a steep price: the loss of authenticity. For Nietzsche, true freedom requires the courage to challenge the herd and forge one's own path. Even if it means facing isolation, imagine someone deciding to break away from life's conventional script: a stable job, a linear career, or a lifestyle that makes sense to everyone around them. By making choices that deviate from the norm, this person may become a target of criticism and doubt. Are you sure about this? Why not choose the safer path? These questions are the voice of the herd, pulling the individual back to the comfort zone, because those who dare to be different threaten the group's stability. Nietzsche believed that this initial departure from the herd is a sign that we are moving toward freedom. But this freedom comes with a cost: the discomfort of isolation. Yet, it is in this discomfort that true autonomy begins to take shape. How many dreams have been abandoned out of fear of facing the critical gaze of the group? How many ideas have been silenced to avoid judgment? Challenging the herd is not just a matter of choice. It is an act of resistance. It is saying no to conventions that do not align with our values, and yes to a life guided by our own principles. Nietzsche saw this courage as a prerequisite for authenticity. He reminds us that the herd does not want our freedom, it wants our obedience. Thus, the courage to challenge the herd is not simply about walking away from the group. It is about affirming one's individuality. It is the only way to achieve a freedom that is truly ours, where every decision reflects who we are, rather than what others expect of us. Isolation, often associated with fragility, is, in fact, a powerful tool for strengthening autonomy. Nietzsche viewed distancing oneself from external influences as an essential exercise for developing emotional and intellectual independence. Just as a muscle grows stronger through resistance, the mind becomes more resilient when it confronts the discomfort of solitude. Consider figures like Steve Jobs, who spent time in India seeking inspiration and self-discovery before founding Apple. This period of retreat helped him question conventions and develop a unique creative vision. Or Virginia Woolf, whose intentional solitude was crucial for crafting her revolutionary literary works. Even Nelson Mandela, during his 27 years in prison, found the clarity and strength to emerge as a leader of a transformative movement. Nietzsche believed that isolation is more than just a moment of reflection. It is preparation to engage with the world in a more conscious and assertive way. By isolating themselves, individuals build a solid foundation to resist external pressures and sustain their own freedom. It is like learning to walk without crutches. At first, it is uncomfortable and even frightening. But over time, an unshakable inner strength emerges. This strengthening is essential for those who seek to live according to their own values. It is not just about resisting the herd, but about developing an independent mind, capable of navigating social pressures without losing authenticity. Nietzsche saw this resilience as the core of true freedom. Isolation, therefore, does not weaken. It strengthens, as long as it is approached not as an escape, but as a space for growth. Withdrawing from the world can prepare us to live in it more fully and autonomously in contemporary society. Solitude is often seen as something to be avoided at all costs. Modern life is structured to keep people constantly busy or distracted, offering an endless stream of stimuli that prevent any real encounter with themselves. For Nietzsche, however, avoiding solitude is to deny the possibility of growth and authenticity. An example of this is the cult of productivity. Many fill every moment of their lives with tasks, deadlines, and commitments, not out of necessity but to escape the discomfort of silence. This relentless pace prevents introspection, diverting attention from deeper questions. Am I living according to my values or someone else's? Do the choices I've made reflect who I am, or just what is expected of me? Nietzsche viewed this rejection of isolation as an escape from difficult but essential questions. Another risk of avoiding solitude is the dependence on external validation. When we neglect introspection, we begin to rely on the expectations and opinions of others to guide our decisions. This behavior creates a vicious cycle. The more we flee from isolation, the more we become prisoners of the collective. For Nietzsche, this dependence is a threat to freedom, as it prevents us from living by our own rules. The danger of avoiding isolation lies not only in what we lose, but in what we fail to become. Without the space to reflect and question, our lives may be shaped by patterns and influences we never consciously chose. The courage to face solitude is, in truth, the courage to confront oneself. Nietzsche reminds us that true freedom demands facing solitude rather than fleeing from it. Escaping silence may seem comfortable in the short term, but in the long term, it comes at a high cost to authenticity and autonomy. Isolation, when embraced as a space for transformation, allows us to rebuild our relationship with ourselves and the world. If solitude can be a gateway to freedom, how can we make it bearable and productive? Nietzsche believed isolation is fertile ground for growth, but he also understood that few are prepared to deal with the discomfort it brings. Fortunately, there are practices that can transform solitude into a space of empowerment and self-discovery. One such practice is creating daily moments of introspection, short periods of silence in the morning. Walks without technological devices, or even practicing meditation, provide the mind with an opportunity to reorganize itself away from external pressures. These moments help filter out external voices and reconnect us with what truly matters. Another powerful tool is reflective writing. Recording thoughts and emotions not only organizes the mind, but also allows repressed patterns or desires to surface. Nietzsche himself used letters and notes as a space to process his reflections and shape his ideas. Writing is not just an internal dialogue, it's a way to bring clarity to what is often clouded by the noise of daily life. Philosophical or literary readings can also be transformative. Texts that provoke and challenge help us question our beliefs and expand our understanding of ourselves and the world. Solitude ceases to be an emptiness and becomes an opportunity to deepen critical thinking and creativity. These tools show that isolation, when consciously utilized, need not be feared. On the contrary, it can become the space where we find the clarity and strength to live more authentically. Nietzsche believed this. In silence, all things find their true form. By transforming isolation into a space for reflection and growth, we pave the way for a deeper and more meaningful freedom. For Nietzsche, solitude was not a burden but a conscious choice, the necessary price for those seeking authenticity and freedom. He believed that humanity's greatest achievements often arise not amid noise and crowds, but in silence and introspection. His own life reflects this. Isolated by health issues and misunderstood by his contemporaries, Nietzsche wrote some of philosophy's most impactful works during long periods of seclusion. Nietzsche viewed solitude as an indispensable condition for achieving greatness. To him, anyone wishing to overcome the limitations imposed by the world must first distance themselves from its influences. Whoever wants to live upward must be willing to live in silence, he said. This phrase encapsulates his view that solitude is not a loss, but a portal to authenticity and creative strength. What Nietzsche leaves us with is a provocative invitation. How can we transform solitude into a tool for reinventing ourselves in an era that glorifies connection and fears isolation? He reminds us that silence can be a powerful ally, far from being a withdrawal from the world. Solitude is a means of building something truly worthwhile. By approaching isolation not as a weakness, but as an opportunity, we follow Nietzsche's path, one of freedom that does not depend on external validation. He challenges us with a question that still resonates today. What would you do if you weren't afraid of being alone? This question captures his legacy, a call to embrace solitude as the ground where human potential reaches its greatest expression.